copy. I want to, for the benefit of our audience, read one portion of it, which goes as follows. The special counsel said Biden's conduct, quote, presented serious risks to national security given the vulnerability of extraordinarily sensitive information to loss or compromise to America's adversaries. But addressing those risks when pursuing criminal charges, the only means available to this office is not the proper remedy here. That is a direct quote from Robert Hur's 345-page report. Senior investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge is outside the Justice Department. Catherine, that's one section of it. Other parts of the report that you've been able to digest, and please summarize for us.
Well, Major, good to be with you. As you mentioned, this 345-page report by the special counsel stops short of recommending criminal charges, but it is harshly critical of the then Vice President Joe Biden's handling of highly classified information. It states, quote, he willfully retained and disclosed classified materials after he was vice president and as a private citizen. But based on the evidence, special counsel Robert Hur felt that once it got in front of a jury, if it went to trial, there would be circumstances of reasonable doubt. The investigation looked at two buckets of classified information. Some of these records, Major, were clearly marked classified. They had to do with military and foreign policy decisions involving Afghanistan. And the second bucket was a series of personal notebooks that then Vice President Joe Biden kept. He would take notes during the president's daily briefing. This is one of the most highly classified briefings that's prepared by the CIA for the White House. And then he also took notes during National Security Council meetings. The special counsel found, as you mentioned, that the retention of this material in unsecure locations did present a national security risk. But he goes to great lengths to draw a contrast with the classified documents case that is now being prosecuted against former President Donald Trump. Robert Hur says in this circumstance that there was strong cooperation from President Biden. Also, it was possible that some of these documents marked classified may have been moved to different facilities without his knowledge. Some were recovered in situations where it seemed clear that they had been forgotten about. And finally, all of this put together was likely to create enough reasonable doubt that jurors would not convict on the mishandling of classified records.
Catherine, thank you so very much. I want to turn now to our CBS News legal contributor, Jessica Levinson. Jessica, the natural question, understandable question for our audience, if no on former Vice President Biden, now President Biden, and yes on former President Trump, why?
I think just as Catherine was explaining in her excellent reporting, because there's a difference here in terms of the level of cooperation. What we have in the case pending against former President Trump are allegations that he obstructed the investigation, that the Department of Justice, that the National Archives said over and over again, we want those documents back. And he said no, that there was willful retention of the documents. So do we have two people who had documents that they should not have had? Absolutely. But the similarities really end there, because the story with respect to current President Biden is one of eventual transparency, of saying, at least publicly, I welcome this investigation. Come look in my office. Come look in my residence. And of complying with the investigators. That is the dividing line. When we look at the public reporting based on President Biden, is there any question that he shouldn't have had these documents? Absolutely not. But is there any question that he engaged in the same type of willful retention and obstruction that allegedly occurred with respect to former President Trump? No, there is not. Again, that is the dividing line here.
Jessica, I want to share with our audience some pictures that are contained in Special Counsel Robert Hur's report of areas in which these documents were stored. I don't know how to read them other than to say, this isn't how you do it. And they are similar in that sense to what we saw for former President Trump. Things of sensitive nature in places that don't read or look at any level to be sensitively guarded. Your thoughts about that?
Exactly right. There's no question here that President Biden should not have retained these documents, that this is not how you retain these documents, and that this is inappropriate. And as Catherine highlighted from the report, that it presents national security risks. But so then we have to ask again, why no criminal charges? Because, and I know it sounds like I'm repeating myself, but it's that difference between saying, I did something wrong, I have documents I shouldn't have, you are welcome to continue to investigate. Here's what I know, and here's the key to my front door. Come on in. And with respect to the allegations against former President Trump, I won't give these over. Allegedly, I will try and hide them. I will try and cover up that I had them at all. That's where you see a difference in why in one case we're looking at federal criminal charges. In another case, we're looking at a special counsel report saying you should not have done that.
Jessica Levinson, thank you very much. I'm going to turn now to our senior White House correspondent, Weijia Jiang, who joins us from the North Lawn of the White House. Weijia, this report was a concern, a meta concern for the Biden White House. No charges, but some harsh language.
Some harsh language, Major, that shows exactly what the White House and the president has said all along, that he made mistakes with regard to how meticulous he should have been. But he also said that the intention here matters, and he never intended to have any classified documents. And even though we have not heard directly from the president yet since this report was released, he did issue a pretty bold statement through the White House counsel's office when we know that he declined to assert any executive privilege over any portion of this report. So what does that mean? In practical terms, it means that if he had requested to assert executive privilege, some portions of this report could have been redacted. There could have been black lines. We have seen this in the past in other special counsel investigations in which certain portions are kept from Congress or the public in order to preserve the ability for the president to have confidential discussions or for matters of national security. The president decided, no, I do not want any of this report to be redacted. And so in saying that, it tracks with what he has said before with regard to the investigation. And he has said, I have nothing to hide. Please come to my house. There's no need for search warrants. There's no need to make this more complicated, which is exactly what Jessica just said, because the president says it's not just about whether he had these documents. It's about whether he meant to have them, and B, what he did when he realized that he did have them. And as we've been talking about, he says he did everything right after that, and that should matter. And apparently the special counsel agrees.
And Weijia, it's also worth pointing out, and perhaps you can offer a little bit more information about this, the president was interviewed by the special counsel, correct?
He was. 2 full days of interview. So, again, he wanted to share as much information as possible without saying I did something wrong. In the many public remarks that he has said about this, he has said that he should have done better, that his staff should have done better to keep those documents and turn them in where they should have gone. Now, Major, it's one thing for the president not to face any charges in this case, but he does face some political challenges. And I have spoken with some Biden aides who are very well aware that the Trump camp is going to do everything it can to bring this back to light and to say that there is a level of hypocrisy here, because they're going to argue that these two men did the same thing, but the two outcomes could be different and that it's unfair. And so now they really have to try to push this message, Major, to reiterate why these two cases are different and why, it matters how you handle the sensitive, top secret information after the fact that you realize you have it. But it could be tough, right? Because, at the end of the day, you do have two former presidents, former vice president, a sitting president, with documents that they were not supposed to have. But they are aware of this challenge, and they do plan to address it head on with very strong messaging about how the president did everything right with regard to how he handled this after he realized he had those documents.
Did everything right after he realized he had done something wrong. Weijia Jiang at the White House. Robert Costa, there is a show and tell component to this report. We just had some pictures of unsecure document holding at the president's garage. There are some pictures up on the screen now of the Penn Biden Center here in Washington. There will be a lot of examination of these pictures and their underlying relevance. I know it's been just a few moments. Have you seen or detected anything from the Hill, meaning Congress, from Republicans on this decision from the special counsel not to charge, and your overall appraisal of the political environment in which this decision will land?
Major, this report marks the end of the special counsel's investigation, and he is not issuing any decision on charging, not moving forward with charges of President Biden, but it is only the beginning of the political battle over the conclusion here to not issue charges of President Biden. On Capitol Hill, my top Republican sources have said for weeks now that if there was not a prosecution of President Biden, should there be evidence that suggested he willfully retained documents that were classified in nature and didn't handle things properly, they might take it into their own bailiwick, take it to Capitol Hill to pursue possible impeachment. This is a House GOP majority that has only in recent days pursued impeachment of the DHS Secretary, Alejandro Mayorkas, and there has been already a sprawling investigation of President Biden, his family, and the family finances. So you put on top of all of that this new special counsel report, and you see ammunition potentially not only for former President Trump as this campaign heats up, but for congressional Republicans to swing the spotlight onto President Biden. And even if he defines his conduct as something that was not worthy of prosecution, and he cites this report as something that backs up his position, because of the details in the report, you can expect this to be a constant refrain for Republicans in the coming months.
Before we go back to Catherine Herridge at the Justice Department, Robert, I just want to ask you this because you brought up the earlier effort this week. Feels like a long time ago, but it was just a couple of days ago. Alejandro Mayorkas, the move to impeach him in the House, failed. And there were some Republicans who were saying it didn't meet the constitutional threshold. You have heard, I've heard, some House Republicans uncertain about the case against President Biden. Does what happened in the Mayorkas impeachment effort in any way, do you think, discourage Republicans from going that far on President Biden?
There are some Republicans like Congressman Mike Gallagher of Wisconsin, who have been averse to using impeachment as a tool at this political moment for Republicans with such a narrow majority in the House. But Mike Johnson, this new Speaker of the House, is facing enormous pressure to scrutinize Biden, to possibly move forward with impeachment charges. And this was a constant threat to his predecessor, Kevin McCarthy, politically. If you don't take dramatic steps, we'll take dramatic steps against you. That's the context of which all of this is beginning to unfold just this second, just this hour on Capitol Hill.
Robert Costa, thank you. Catherine Herridge, I want to go back to you at the Justice Department. You and your team of producers have had a bit more time to read through the report. Your other conclusions or observations, please.
Well, Major, a few things stand out. We're still combing through this 345-page report. One is that the special counsel found that Joe Biden retained classified records from his time in the Senate. And I would emphasize that as a sitting senator, he would have had no authority to remove highly classified materials from what's called a SCIF or secure facility. This investigation, we say, is broad, but I think some of the data can help you scope that. It's 173 interviews, 147 witnesses, 7 million records were reviewed by the special counsel. It goes on to emphasize the importance of the interview with President Biden in October, but it also notes that there were significant gaps in his memory of those events, and those gaps or the lack of information would not sit well with the jury if it ever went to trial. It would create what the special counsel called reasonable doubt. Just finally, there's sort of a bottom line for people who work in the intelligence community. You can't emphasize enough the sensitivity of top secret information that was involved in this case, also what they call compartmented information. That's highly classified intelligence. Sources and methods are especially fragile. They can include human spies, they can include satellite imagery. So to have this information held in unsecure locations, this is a very real risk of compromise. And the intelligence officials I know say it's deeply disappointing to see any senior member of an administration behave in what they describe as a cavalier fashion with this highly sensitive information.
Catherine, I don't want to put you on the spot, and if you don't know the answer, please just let me know. But in the report, is there any information that sort of gives a number to documents and a number of notes? And is there, from a classification point of view, any relevant distinction between a document itself or a note taken by a principal about something that was classified?
You know, we're still going through the special counsel report. We haven't seen a specific number as to the records that were marked classified. We know from the description in the report that the Vice President Joe Biden's personal notes were voluminous, but you make an important point. In the world of classified information, it doesn't matter whether the record is stamped, classified, top secret, or whether it has no marking at all, like someone's personal notes. It's the value and the content of the information that makes it classified. So at the end of the day, it was highly classified information that the special counsel found had been secured in a way that was not in keeping with the protection of this information by a very senior person in administration who would have known the guideposts for doing it effectively.
Catherine Herridge at the Justice Department. To conclude, the special counsel Robert Hur has decided no charges will be filed against President Biden for his mishandling of classified documents, both notes he took and documents themselves, while as vice president and as a senator. Our coverage will continue on CBS News Streaming, your local news, and of course tonight on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Good day.
All right, we continue to follow breaking news here on CBS News. Hey there, everyone. I'm Errol Barnett.
And I'm Lana Zach. We have been following this breaking news that's happening right now about the special counsel Robert Hur's report to Congress.
That's right. The Justice Department will not be pressing criminal charges against President Biden over his handling of classified documents.
In November of 2022, roughly 24 classified documents were found in President Biden's possession stemming from his time in office as vice president. The documents were recovered from offices that he had previously used, along with President Biden's private residences.
Now, Attorney General Merrick Garland says the Justice Department is committed to making as much of Special Counsel Robert Hur's report public as possible.
CBS News senior investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge has been covering all the ins and outs of this case for us. Catherine, good to have you. So let's just start off with something that you were saying to Major a little bit ago, which is that it is deeply disappointing that somebody in the very top layers of our government would be so cavalier with top secret national security information. Is there surprise that, given all of that, that the special counsel decided not to press any charges, or recommend charges, rather?
Well, this is a fascinating report in many respects. It's 345 pages. Its bottom line up front is that the special counsel found that President Biden willfully retained and disclosed classified information after he was vice president as a private citizen. But the special counsel says, based on the totality of the evidence, he does not believe that criminal charges are warranted, in part because the circumstances surrounding the retention of the classified information would raise reasonable doubt with a jury. So what he's saying here is, in some respects, this administration was very cooperative with the special counsel. There isn't evidence of obstruction. The way in which these documents were found at his residence in Delaware, for example, suggests that they may have been forgotten about. It's also possible some of these records were moved to his offices post vice president by other individuals, and it was done without his knowledge. The part where it's a lot trickier is his personal diaries, his notebooks that he kept. He took notes of these highly classified briefings called the President's Daily Brief. This is put together by the CIA and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and then also National Security Council meetings. And that's clearly classified information, and it was held in an unsecure location. But it goes down to this question of intent. And the special counsel found there just wasn't evidence of intent to harm national security in this case that would warrant a criminal prosecution.
And I know, Catherine, as we sift through the special counsel's findings and the report, the classified information is quite relevant. It refers to things like the war in Afghanistan. It alludes to what they describe as an Afghanistan folder containing 100 pages of documents. Take us inside what was found exactly and what type of information would be at risk with these types of documents in unsecured locations.
Well, the special counsel says in the report that there are 2 buckets of classified information that his investigators reviewed. The first was a series of records that had classification markings. That means they were obviously classified records, and they related to foreign policy and military issues surrounding the war in Afghanistan. The second bucket of classified information were Vice President Joe Biden's personal notes. As I mentioned, they were taken during these highly classified briefings, the President's daily brief, as well as these National Security Council meetings. That, even though they're not marked classified, they still have the same sensitivities in place. So when they talk about top secret information, in this case also compartmented information, in this case, compartmented means that it's so sensitive because it's fragile, sources and methods. So think about things like human spying, for example. The disclosure of the information could lead to the loss of life. Also think about methods like spy satellites. The disclosure of this information could lead to the compromise, the loss of that avenue for intelligence collection. And some of these, it can take years or decades to replace. Some of them, like human spies, can never be replaced at all. So that's the kind of sensitivity of intelligence that we're talking about.
All right, Catherine, stay right there. We're going to bring into this conversation now CBS News senior White House correspondent Weijia Jiang. She's there outside of the White House. I understand that the president was just seen leaving the White House a little bit ago, but didn't provide any additional information. Weijia, what are you hearing from the president's team?
That's right. The president left here to attend an event in Virginia, and he would have had the opportunity to speak to the cameras, but he chose not to. We do know that we just got a new statement from the White House special counsel, Richard Sauber, who said that he is pleased this investigation has concluded and that the special counsel found no criminal charges are warranted in this matter. He goes on to outline what we've been talking about, which is the president's response when he found out he did have classified information. The special counsel writes that not only was there no obstruction, the president's cooperation throughout this 15-month investigation has been extraordinary. And so the White House counsel here, of course, speaking on behalf of President Biden, saying that, this is the right result. However, we should mention that at the very end, they also write that we disagree with a number of inaccurate and inappropriate comments in the special counsel's report. Perhaps he was referring to some of the way that President Biden was characterized in this report. And I do have one example. They write that they considered that at trial, Mr. Biden would likely present himself to a jury, as he did during our interview of him, as a sympathetic, well-meaning, elderly man with a poor memory. And so that was part of the calculus, right? How this would be received by a jury. Would there be an amount of reasonable doubt that, a jury would say the president did not actually do anything criminally wrong here, which, of course, is what the president's team and he himself have said all along. They have acknowledged that perhaps then Vice President Biden should have been more meticulous with the way he handled these documents, but he himself has said he didn't have any intention to do that, and then reiterated that after the fact he welcomed searches in all of his homes, that he did not try to stand in the way of this investigation at all. So even though we now have a conclusion from the special counsel, this now pivots to the political arena. Mm-hmm. And Biden aides are very well aware of how the Trump campaign might try to use this against President Biden and say there is some level of hypocrisy because the outcome might not be the same for the two men, who they argue did the exact same thing. Of course, as this report outlines, the handling and the after actions were very, very different.
It's an eye-opening statement you've just shared with us, Weijia, because on one hand, it's a win for President Biden in that the DOJ is deciding against charges. But on the other hand, in this defense, that the White House takes issue with the language of describing him as a well-meaning elderly man with poor memory. I mean, effectively, they're saying, well, don't make the argument that he's an old guy and he can't remember, because there's also this political campaign coming up where both candidates will be at each other's throats. I mean, he did make himself available for an interview. He did waive executive privilege, but still there is a political liability for President Biden now.
Right. And to be clear, in the statement from the White House counsel, he did not specifically mention that page from the special counsel's report that I read. I was just using that as an example of some language that perhaps the White House could take issue with because it paints him in a certain light that might not be flattering, especially when there are so many questions already about President Biden's mental fitness. But you're absolutely right in that even the very statement that declares victory includes an acknowledgement that there are, things in this report that could be detrimental to the president when you are talking about how this sort of shapes the public view of him and, how he handled these documents and whether it was enough, whether it's enough of an explanation to say, yes, I did something wrong when I didn't handle these properly, but then I handled it correctly. So it really is up to the court of public opinion what potential voters will do with this information and if it will rise to the level that it impacts their decision at the polls.
Absolutely. Great to get all of the latest information from you, Weijia, there for us at the White House. We want to bring in Nick Lewis now. He's the founding and managing member of the Lewis law firm in Washington. The headline here being that there are no charges against President Biden for this classified documents mess. But what does it mean for our viewers and for voters who will likely have two candidates who both mishandle private documents?
Well, thanks for having me, Errol. And yeah, thank you for having me. It's a really fascinating question because I think there's, on the one hand, there is the legal issues, which may or may not have now been resolved now that we have this report from the special counsel, and then there are separately the political questions. And so, from a legal standpoint, a special counsel, as you've covered, was appointed and has now concluded his work and concluded that no charges are going to be brought. But obviously, as you also covered, there's a lot of information in this report that that people are going to pick at, and they're going to say, look, here you have an instance just like with former President Trump, where there were really sensitive documents. They weren't maintained in the right place. And there's at least some evidence in the report that President Biden, when he was the vice president or left office, actually knew that he had found classified information, hadn't turned it over. What they're going to point to that distinguishes this from former President Trump is this level of cooperation, that when this came to light, he fully cooperated, consented to searches of his homes and all of that. And so people can debate that from a legal perspective, but from a political perspective, I think it's going to be a little bit harder. And I think that supporters of the former President Trump are going to say, look, this is a double standard here, and we'll have to see what the voters decide.
I want to dig a little bit deeper into that, Nick. In part because this point that you're making about what he did afterwards, that he was cooperative, former President Trump was not cooperative, and in fact tried, according to the special counsel in that case, to hide the documents. In both cases, we see these gentlemen sharing this classified information, it seems, with people who were not supposed to have it. And in former President Trump's case, him acknowledging on one of those tapes, you're not supposed to be seeing this, I'm not supposed to have this, and I'm showing it to you, in essence. But what does the law say in terms of intent? Because you're right that politically there's going to be people all across this country right now dissecting these two different courses that special counsels have taken. But what does the law actually say in terms of how much your cooperation after the fact matters in terms of your criminal culpability?
Terrific question, Lana. And, if you look at the report from special counsel Hur, he says on page 1, our investigation uncovered evidence that President Biden willfully retained and disclosed classified materials after his vice presidency when he was a private citizen. And so the special counsel there is saying, look, we have evidence that President Biden, when he had just left office as vice president, violated the law. But the special counsel goes further and in reaching the determination that he does not believe the criminal charges are warranted here, and ventures into the realm of prosecutorial discretion. There is discussion in the report here about how the special counsel does not believe that they would be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that President Biden had willfully retained these documents, and they pick at a little bit of their own evidence that they've uncovered to say, look, there's weakness here. I mean, there's one statement, it looks like, where he acknowledges that he had discovered classified information, but maybe we don't think that's going to be enough to convict. And because of the extensive level of cooperation, which he just referenced, we take that into account when we as prosecutors are making a determination about whether or not to prosecute someone. And that's not unusual. I mean, prosecutors do that all the time. They do it with corporations. They do that with individuals about whether or not people are providing the level of cooperation once an issue has been brought to their attention and has taken all sorts of steps to sort of make the situation better. So it's not inappropriate, but I do think that that's something that's going to be, definitely scrutinized very closely.
Well, Nick, I want to pick up on your point with our Catherine Herridge, if Catherine is still with us, because what Nick is saying here is that it does point in this report that there is reasonable doubt to believe that a jury would convict or blame Biden for hanging on to these things. But that's extremely subjective, Catherine. And couldn't you also argue that a man who's been in elected office for decades should know better? What do you make of that piece of this report?
These cases are very difficult, Errol, because it relies on a set of statutes that don't always require intent in these cases. For example, the unlawful retention of national defense information, or the mishandling of national defense information, or gross negligence in the handling of national defense information. So it doesn't always come down to intent in the law, but in the courtroom, intent is very important, and the issue of reasonable doubt. And as your last guest just said, the question of prosecutorial misconduct. What jumps out at me is that this special counsel report is really a split decision for the White House. On the one hand, it doesn't recommend criminal charges in this case, that if it got to a jury, there would be a reasonable doubt and there wasn't sufficient evidence to convict. But I think it also creates political exposure. Did he really follow the laws that he's in charge of enforcing when it comes to highly classified information? And then also the note by the special counsel that while the president sat for an interview, his memory was poor. There were a lot of gaps in that memory, and he felt that that would work to his advantage in a trial, but it may not work to his advantage politically as he seeks a second term in office.
Indeed, and that's where we will leave it. Catherine Herridge, Weijia Jiang, Nick Lewis, we want to thank you all.
All right, so much breaking developments today. At this moment, we're going to take a breath and a very short break. Next, though, we'll take you to the Pentagon for the latest on that investigation into the helicopter crash that killed 5 Marines in California. You're streaming CBS News.
Well, let me start with this.
This really happened.
Have you told the government?
Did any of that make sense?
What's your response?
You want me to just
What's
keep
wrong
going?
with that argument?
What have you learned?
Do you know why?
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 It's time for 60 Minutes, Sunday on CBS.